media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View. First of all, I want to say congratulations to some of those who made it into the Final Four. And if you've been watching baseball, of course, we had opening season the other day. But I think most of you probably have a question on your mind. If you were listening last week, you know that we did our Truth Team week. And we still have the banner up, Anchored to Truth. And we have the goal there. And some of you would like to know. And I am proud and excited to announce that we met our goal because of the gifts that you brought in. Now, that brings us to a couple of other key points. Number one, making the goal only was accomplished because every single one of those gifts counted towards that goal. As I've said before, no gift is too large, no gift is too small. We couldn't have done it with the large gifts, but I don't think we could have done it with some of the small gifts. So you were a participant in that. Number two, I think there are some of you that are saying, well, I was traveling last week or meant to give, but I didn't get around to it. Well, we still have the banner up, and the reason I do is that very close to the end of the program on Friday, we had somebody actually provide a match gift of $10,000. That money, some of that money is still available. So if you have said to yourself, well, I didn't have a chance to participate last week, I meant to give, I didn't get around to making that phone call or going to the website, the good news is you could give right now or the next couple of days, all amounts to today and maybe tomorrow, and then we'll move on to some others. But the good news is sometimes people want to know, well, there's a match on the table, and the answer is, yes, there is, until we use it up. So I just wanted you to know that, first of all, we met the goal. Number two, we met most of the matches, but one is outstanding, so you could give today if you would want to do so. And again, that's very easy. Go to the website, pointofview.net. There's a banner there. It says Anchor to Truth. You can click on that red button that says Join Now. Of course, you can also call the number that we've been giving out last week, 1-800-347-5151. 1-800-347-5151. I do believe we have a few staff ready to answer that phone call if you would like to make it. You will see that we have an email going out, and maybe you've received it. I haven't seen mine yet, giving you that announcement, but I thought you'd like to know. So lots of good news, and again, opportunity for you if you wanted to give, but first of all, and most importantly, thank those of you that did give. We certainly do appreciate it. As we said, we could not do it without you. We're going to spend some time in this first hour talking about a couple of things. A very new and good book coming out, Image Bearers, Shifting from Pro-Birth to Pro-Life by Herbie Newell, but he is also an individual that is the president and executive director of the Lifeline Children's Services. So we're going to talk a little bit about their adoption services as well as this new book, which gets into the whole issue. When we're pro-life, we're not just pro-birth, we're pro-life after birth too. And we're going to talk about what that means, especially when we get into issues ranging from adoption to sexual trafficking, pornography, family formation, and the rest. And then in the second hour, as you might imagine, there have a lot of things been happening over the weekend, and even some that we didn't even get to on Friday that we'll be talking about. And so a number of articles, one from the New York Times, one from the Los Angeles Times, one interesting enough responding to an article was in Atlantic. So again, I think you will see, and also one from Fortune magazine. So we'll have some from a variety of different sources that we'll be talking about in the second hour. But let's, if we can, welcome to the program Herbie Newell, individual that is the president and executive director of Lifeline Children's Services, holds an MBA from Samford University, lives in Birmingham, Alabama. And Herbie, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me. What an honor. And I'm one of those heartbroken teams from the Final Four weekend that you spoke about at the very beginning in your introduction here in Alabama. But glad to be here.
Well, glad to have you there. And from time to time, we make our way to Birmingham there because we are heard on that program. But just before we get into your book, because I want to spend most of our time there, Lifeline Children's Services really have, if you will, 7 key initiatives and programs. I don't know if you need to go through all 7, but it's pretty extensive. And I wanted people to know that if they wanted to know more information, they can click on your picture or go down to lifelinechild.org and find out more. But give us an overview real quickly.
Yeah, 100%. You know, as an organization, our heartbeat is to intervene on behalf of women and children that are going through crisis. And we ultimately want to be an expert in helping with adoption. So we want to help young women who are going through those crisis pregnancies find permanence for the child after birth, so that child would be in a home for us where they will hear and see and know the gospel of Christ Jesus. We want to equip the church to be ready to adopt and to wrap around young women. But then the second, and where most of our programs lie, is we want to be attentive to those vulnerable children once they're born, and realizing that children that are born to vulnerability, they have the propensity to stay in that vulnerability. Single moms sometimes don't make the best choices, especially if they're also vulnerable, and kids will end up in foster care, in groups homes, or orphanages. And we really want to attend to the needs of those children by protecting them, by helping reunite them with their families if possible, by sustaining them through this vulnerability, and ultimately launching vulnerable children into permanence in a relationship with the Lord, but also in a place where they can have their lives changed, reoriented, and to be a productive member of society. And so all of our programs really go into that, adopting children to give them a new start, or if adoption is not in their picture, to really be attentive to the needs of those children and to follow them, because we ultimately, even like the book says, we want to be pro-life even after that life comes to be, not just pro-birth.
I might just mention, too, endorsements from David Platt and Russell Moore and individuals been on the program, Kevin Ezell and Daniel Darling, just to mention a few of the people we've had on over the last couple of months. And it is a book that I think people are really going to appreciate. Image Bearers, it goes into so many different issues that we talk about here on Point of View. And one of the things I do appreciate is the fact that at the end of each chapter, and there are 12 chapters, you have an opportunity for some questions, some discussion, some ways in which you could continue. So if somebody says, after they've heard this for a while, this would be something that would be good for my Bible study or my small group or my Sunday school class or my life fellowship or something like that, this is certainly the case. But since you mentioned it real quickly, we, I think, want to help the world know that this idea that, well, pro-life people only care about the baby inside the womb. They don't care at all about the mother, the child outside. That's one of the reasons we wanted not only to have you on the program, but to talk about your book.
Yeah, I think that's a fallacy at times that the pro-abortion movement has against the Church of Christ Jesus, but also against pro-life people, is that we don't care about the child once it's born. And I don't think that's true. As a matter of fact, I see so many churches around the country that are caring for life. Obviously, we believe that life is sacred. We fight for the right to life. We fight for life at the end of life. You know, we're caring for the poor, the needy, the vulnerable. As a matter of fact, throughout time, there's been no other institution that has been a go-to, like the Church of Jesus Christ, that has been the place where ultimately the vulnerable find rescue and the vulnerable find need. But I think what we really need to do is we need to reclaim that place and make sure the world knows that that's our position.
We'll take a break and continue our conversation with Herbie Newell and Image Bearers. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
If you want to understand the collapse of the Judeo-Christian consensus in this country, you need to look beyond individual programs and policies and take a more expansive view. In a speech for Hillsdale last year, Christopher Rufo of the Manhattan Institute provided a multi-decade description. The original leftist dream expected a rebellion from the working class in America. That never took place by the end of the 1960s. Leftists therefore abandoned their original plan of waging a revolution with the proletariat and instead focused on the elites. The idea can easily be traced to an Italian communist by the name of Antonio Gramsci, who I sometimes mention on my radio program. He proposed capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society. This long march through American institutions began a half-century ago, and if you look around today, you can see that it has been most successful. Christopher Rufo says that he has looked at the federal bureaucracy, the universities, K-12 schools, and big corporations. What he found is the revolutionary ideas of the 1960s have been repackaged, repurposed, and injected into American life at the institutional level. He adds that most Americans were shocked to discover this. They were outraged that children were being taught gender theory and critical race theory, that the educational elite saw no problem with teaching about race, sex, and gender at very young ages. Those revelations and the inevitable backlash had an impact on various state and local elections and will continue to be issues parents will need to address in the future. The lesson here is that all of this didn't happen by chance, but was planned decades ago. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Inflation, go to viewpoints.info/inflation. That's viewpoints.info/inflation. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Our guest today, Herbie Newell, as we talk about image bearers shifting from pro-birth to pro-life. One of the things you say, Herbie, is being pro-life means not only do we see abortion as murder, but we also see our apathy towards injustice towards life outside of the womb as a co-conspirator in the fight for life. And so you take on many of those issues. But let's begin with this idea of the case for life, because that seems to me to be foundational to everything else you're going to talk about today.
Yeah, 100%. You know, as believers, we believe and know from God's word that life is sacred from the moment of conception into the moment of natural birth. And because of that, we believe that life, as we see in Psalm 139 and other places, it's known by God, it's cared for by God, and it is given the image of God. And therefore, as his image bearers, we protect that life, and we continue to show that we care both for the mother and the child. And so, you know, one of the things that we argue for in the book, and certainly our ministry would argue for in our action, is that mom's life is equally as valuable as that child's life. And I think so many times as pro-life people, we get placed into a box that we only care about the child. And the truth of the matter is the other side, the pro-abortion, pro-choice side, really only cares about the mom. Pro-life, we care about both that mom and that child. And we know that even separating her from that pregnancy is separating her from God's ordained plan for her life and his ordained plan for woman. Woman is the only image bearer that can bear children in her womb and give birth to life. And that is a unique responsibility given to woman at the very beginning of creation. And so we know that any unnatural taking of life within inside of a woman's womb not only will bring psychological disorder, spiritual disorder, but also physical disorder. And so we want to fight for the life of the woman, but we also want to fight for the life of a child. And I think the way that we care for them, both while the pregnancy is going forward, but also after the postpartum ward, and the way that we care for the mom, the single mom, the way that we care for the child, really starts to show that we truly believe in the sanctity of life.
So well said. One of your chapters is on abortion, and I think that's helpful because you take us back to not only the bombing of Pearl Harbor, but a decision on January 22nd, 1973, when Warren Burger's court voted 7-2 in a case known as Roe versus Wade, and also, of course, Doe versus Bolton, and then take us through kind of how we ended up to where we are today. But most importantly, even there, you want to give some practical steps. Even though most people know you as an individual that works with adoption and foster care and things of that nature, there's still many things we can do in the pro-life movement in that particular venue, right?
Oh, 100%. I think we need to continue to make sure that our local governments, and I think obviously even now since the Dobbs decision, that our state governments know our position, that we advocate for laws that protect life on a state, federal, and local level. But then I also think it means as churches that we are searching for women that are going through an unplanned crisis pregnancy, and we love and care for them. We show them hospitality. We invite them in, we counsel them, and we show them a better way. But it also means sometimes marriage may be the answer to an unplanned pregnancy. And so where it's safe and where it's viable, we need to help connect this man and this woman who've created this child, or who have had this child born to them, created by God, but born to them. We need to foster in those relationships. We need to look for ways to support single moms who choose life. And I hope that we champion these moms that choose life and show our championship by the way that we love them, support them, and walk with them. Not every mom's going to choose adoption. Most moms are going to actually choose to parent. And so are we ready as the church to say we're going to celebrate, not that there's a single child home or a single parent home, but are we going to celebrate that there's a life, and how are we going to work to help that mom to make wise choices in the future that benefit both her and the child?
Wow. One of the questions you ask in one of your other chapters is this: are we willing to be inconvenienced in order to defend life? Because that gets us into whether or not we're truly pro-life. But one of the things I thought was really interesting, Herbie, is that we do a millennial roundtable, and oftentimes we bring in individuals that are younger, and you talk about how in some respects the millennial generation sometimes gets a bad rap, but you do talk about what is maybe a generational shift and how to really navigate that in terms of how we present some of this information. Can you help us out?
Yeah, 100%. I think even in 1973, when the Burger-led court founded the Roe v. Wade decision, one of the things that came through oral arguments was this whole idea of trimesters. As a matter of fact, modern medicine adapted the whole trimester theory based on the Roe v. Wade decision, because there were people that were struggling with, is this life really life, or is it just a clump of cells? The thing about the millennial generation is they have access to technology, ultrasounds, where they can hear a heartbeat, where they can see a child at a very early gestation. Most of the millennial generation and younger generations aren't actually anymore believing the lie that it's just a clump of cells. They see a heartbeat. They see the formation of a true human being. They see the building blocks of what is happening inside the womb to create a full-term life. And so the whole idea that this is just a mass of cells to be destroyed is not something that falls on the younger generation. I think where older generations need to help the millennials and now the Gen Z generation is we need to help them understand that truth is not relative, but that truth is defined. And I think where some of the younger generations struggle is they may say, well, I believe it's life, but I shouldn't make someone else believe my truth.
Right.
I shouldn't make them absolutely agree with me. And we've got to help, as older generations, help those younger generations understand that truth is truth and it needs to be advocated for.
It's kind of interesting, too, because we have a booklet on abortion. Our most recent one is one that Liberty McCarter has done on chemical abortions. But I have found that sometimes when I'm speaking to younger audiences, Counsel for Life has a younger group of individuals, I tend to be pulling some material from the abortion presentation, but quite a bit from the booklet we have on postmodernism, which, again, is based on the idea that you have your view of truth, and I have a different view of truth, and someone else has a third view of truth. And truth is sort of relative. It is not something that you can really observe. It's not objective, but it's relative and it's personal. And it does seem to me that you have really identified that generational shift, that in some respects, as we are speaking to the pro-life issue, many times I think it is important for us to begin to bring individuals back to what you might call first principles. And so that is the case. Just before we take a break, though, because we are coming up to a break and I want to get into some of the other chapters in your book, I thought I might mention that we do have a link to your website, and this would be a perfect time for people to go to lifelinechild.org. And even if they find themselves, well, maybe I'm not really interested in adoption, I might point them to the fact that you have some resources that are very helpful, including the fact that you have a podcast, you have a resource library. So can you share maybe just for a minute, so as people during the break go to your website, tell them kind of where they can find some of that material?
100%. If you go to lifelinechild.org, you look under resources. There are resources for churches, sermon outlines, bulletin inserts to talk about the sanctity of life, to talk about adoption, to talk about foster care. But we also have a learning education portal that you can sign up for even during the break. And there's lots of resources there. You can learn, you can grow in your understanding, but you can also know even and be equipped on how to help that mom down the street who's going through an unplanned pregnancy, or how do you help your church have a heart for orphan and vulnerable children, both on a global stance, but also on a domestic stance. So lots of great resources at lifelinechild.org.
And again, we've only gone through a couple of the chapters, but we'll get into some others, everything from family formation, fatherlessness, having godly men. What about racial reconciliation, and even going all the way back to slavery and sexual trafficking and a number of other issues? So it is a book that covers much more than just, of course, abortion and adoption. It is really saying if we're going to be pro-life, we need to be pro-life in every area of life. So if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to get some more of that information, go to the website right now, especially during the break. If you want a copy of the book, of course, you can get that from them, but also there's a way in which we've posted it so you can get it in paperback, and I think it'll be available in the future very quickly in other formats, so that if you wanted to maybe look at it, read a sample of it, I think you will benefit from it. As I said, 12 chapters, about 220 some odd pages, and with questions at the end. Those of you that maybe would like to do kind of a pro-life Bible study or pro-life small group, this might be the book you might want to consider. Don't have to go through all 12 chapters, but you can pick and choose to actually begin to have people think more creatively and more biblically about these very important issues of life. So we'll continue our conversation with Herbie Newell as we talk about his book, Image Bearers. All that coming up right after this.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, Herbie Newell with us as we're talking about his book, Image Bearers, Shifting from Pro-Birth to Pro-Life. And Herbie, one of your chapters is on racial reconciliation in the gospel. And I really see kind of 3 points. First of all, of course, the issue of racial intolerance and discrimination in the past, even some in the present. And you're even broadening it to look at, of course, what has happened in other countries where those divisions are even more stark than they may be here. Second of all, really working to live in a multicultural world, and that is important in terms of the church. But then finally, as I think most of our listeners would know, the relationship, as you have a whole section on Planned Parenthood and racism. And the fact is that Planned Parenthood was begun because there was an assumption that there were certain races that were superior to other races. And even though this organization, that is Planned Parenthood, has tried to deny its history, that really is very significant in its history and manifested today, even as we look at where some of these abortion clinics are located. So give us kind of an overview, if you could, on this whole issue of how we would apply a pro-life view to the issue of race.
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, the missiology of the church is based upon a multicultural generation, a multicultural world. So many times we read throughout the scripture, right? Even when Jesus says, we know that the end will come when every tribe, tongue, and nation has heard and then had an opportunity to respond to the hope of the gospel. We see in Revelation that there's a multicultural, a multi-tribal, many languages, many people celebrating around the throne. And so what we need to know is from a Christian worldview, from a worldview that's biblical, we know that our family is multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic. And so when we even then apply that to abortion in our nation and our country and the right to life, what we see is so much of the abortion industry was started around this idea of eugenics, of trying to abort the least favorable races. And Margaret Sanger, who founded Planned Parenthood, was very much about eliminating minority races, especially the Black race from the United States. She talked about it openly. She wrote about it openly. It's in a lot of Planned Parenthood's charter documents. And so when we come to this area of life, I think we need to make sure that the world knows what we're for. We are for the flourishing of all life, no matter what race, what culture, what ethnicity, because as God's children, we believe that they bear the image of Christ in different ways. They're bearing the image of Christ. They're bearing the image of God. And so we want to go to the nations. We want to preach the gospel to the nations here at home and around the world, but we also want to preserve the life of those around the world. So any type of genocide, be it abortion or ethnic cleansing that we see around the world, we speak out against injustice because our God made all life in his image to bear the marks of him. And so we become, therefore, people that love the world, not because the world is good, but because Christ Jesus died for the world. And so we want to go into the world and make known the gospel. And we don't want any hindrance against that life to take away an opportunity for every life to hear and to have heard proclaimed the gospel of Jesus Christ crucified.
Well said. Number of chapters that you deal with, and maybe this will be a longer discussion, a chapter that deals with women and honoring marriage, but then one that also recognizes the problem of fatherlessness, and then another one that talks about the need for godly men and strong fathers. And really a very significant middle of your book has to do with the family, and that really goes back to Lifeline Children's Services. You know, you provide adoption services and foster care, even global orphan care, but the next line is family restoration. And you have seen, Herbie, probably more than anyone in the adoption agencies, what is happening, or in some cases not happening, in these homes, broken homes, all sorts of abuse. and all sorts of issues of father absence, either completely absent physically or maybe present but absent emotionally. Can you kind of give us an overview of that? Because in some respects, that's really a very significant section of your book.
Yeah, I think it's the crux of a lot of the issues that we're facing. As a matter of fact, when President Lyndon Johnson came to the office after the assassination of President Kennedy, the Patrick Moynihan was on his cabinet, and Patrick Moynihan wrote something called the Moynihan Report. He said, we have something that's happening in our country where the African-American population is increasingly being born to single parents. As a matter of fact, at the time, it was about 33%. The single parent rate amongst white Caucasian was less than 10%. And for other ethnic minorities, it was somewhere in between the 10 and 33%. And Patrick Moynihan told the president, if we don't address this today, we're going to reap the negative consequences of that in the future. And Kerby, we are reaping the natural consequences of apathy towards fatherlessness, apathy towards fatherless homes. Today, where now the single parent rate among Caucasians is over 40%. The single parent rate in African American homes is almost up to 70%, and the other minorities sit in the middle. And we start to see all of the different things that come apart in our country with policies that are against the family, that aren't pro-family. They're trying to create new genders and create new identities. All of this goes back to the ordination of God's home. And if you look at all of these progressive, hurtful policies, every last one of them comes from the separation of a man and a woman. And that's a battle that started in the garden in Genesis chapter 3, where the very first obviously attack was on the vertical relationship between God and man, but secondarily the attack was on man and wife. And there was enmity and strife put into the relationship. And so we have had an adversary that's tried to attack the family. Abortion, what does it do? It takes children, be fruitful and multiply, away from the marriage unit. What does same-sex marriage does? It says we don't need a multiplicity we don't need a man and a woman. We could have any other gender. And of course, every other policy, like the transgender policy, starts to even begin to separate even further the basic family structure. And we know from God's word, but we also know from sociology that children thrive in a two-parent intact home where both mom and dad are working together for the flourishing of their children. And so for your men that are listening to this that are fathers, this doesn't just mean that we're doing okay if we show up for dinner. This means we need to help our family get off the smartphones. We need to help our families connect. We need to be present in the lives of our children. Our daughters need fathers that will give them their identity, that will give them rock-solid confidence in who they've been created to be as a woman. And our sons need fathers who show them what it means to be a man who loves the Lord God with all of his heart, mind, and soul, to be a leader and to be a strong advocate for women, for children, and for life. And so dads are important and moms are equally as important, because it's from moms that we see beauty and we see strength and we see work and we see the ways that moms love their families no matter what. They show unconditional love to their families. Husband and wife working in unity brings strong and healthy children.
So good. One of the things you talk about is, of course, Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, which back in 1985 was already talking about more things like television. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have smartphones and the rest. But, of course, now 1 in 3 children in America grow up in homes without the influence of a father, but even the ones that are there are sort of absent. And then, quote from the National Fatherhood Initiative, we've had them on before, that children where there is a father absent at home are more than 10 times more likely to experience neglect and abuse. Girls are 7 times more likely to become pregnant as a teenager. Children are 4 times more likely to be a greater risk for poverty. And the list just goes on and on and on for all of that. But then some people might say, well, what about practical suggestions? And this may be the first book I've ever seen that takes some time out of the book of Ruth and Boaz to talk about some things that Boaz, as a man of God, does for Ruth in terms of taking note of fatherlessness, providing for fatherlessness, blessing and affirming individuals in that circumstance. So again, it's a book that I would highly recommend to you because it not only takes on some of the facts, the figures, the statistics that we talk about so often, but then sometimes dives back into Scripture to find some very helpful and practical ideas on how to apply some of those principles. So again, the book is entitled Image Bearers, Shifting from Pro-Birth to Pro-Life. When we come back, we've worked our way through some of the chapters in a mere cursory way, but certainly to give you an overview of that. We want to get back to this whole idea of adoption and orphan care and some of the outreach that is taking place through Lifeline Children's Services. So we'll come back and talk about those issues right after these important messages.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Herbie Newell with us as we talk about his book, Image Bearers, Shifting from Pro-Birth to Pro-Life. And not surprisingly, probably one of the longest chapters in your book is this one near the end, Adoption and Orphan Care. But again, Herbie, one of the things you have done is taken us through not only the practical material that you have certainly developed over the years at Lifeline Children's Services, but take us back into the Scriptures and give us some examples of that as well to help us understand that all children are image bearers, all children are children of God, and that there can be some very practical ways to help the fatherless, to help individuals that are in adoption, and really to begin to consider what we as individuals and the church can do. So I'm going to step back and let you give kind of the message I'm sure you give so often when you speak on this issue of adoption and orphan care.
Yeah, 100%. Thanks, Kerby. You know, one of the things that is so kind about the Lord is he gives over and over again in his word the explanation of why we should care, the command to care. It's in the Old Testament. It's in the New Testament. It starts in Leviticus when the Lord says in Leviticus 19 to a mostly agrarian society, when you go into your fields, don't beat down your olive trees, don't go out and take everything, but leave a piece for the triad of the vulnerable, the orphan, the widow, the stranger, and the alien. And then you see it in the New Testament when James 1:27 says, pure and undefiled religion in the sight of God our Father is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained from the world. And of course, our adoption is even seen in Galatians and Ephesians and Romans as our salvific. Adoption is mirrored to our salvation in a beautiful imagery that Paul uses. But then even in the New Testament, in the Gospels, we see an adoptive love displayed by even Joseph, who's adopted Jesus. He's not his birth father. He's his adopted father who took Mary in and Jesus in so that there would be a home. And you see the protection of Joseph and what he does for the Messiah, for Jesus the Christ. He protects him. He takes care of his mom when he's still in the womb, protecting her from stoning, protecting her from abuse or from violence because, quote unquote, she had transgressed the Jewish law. He then cares for her every need, cares for the needs of the Messiah. And even in Matthew, we see that Joseph is in a dream, is warned that Herod is coming for the Christ, and he flees and he protects, again, this new family by taking them to Egypt. And Kerby, I think as the church, that's what we've been called to do, to mirror this adoptive love of God, to mirror this adoptive love that we see out of Joseph, and to mirror the commands of Scripture. And you mentioned, we see it in Ruth, some practical calls to care of how as a church we truly can begin to care for orphan and vulnerable children. And I'll just say this, a lot of times we like to talk about unreached people groups, and I would like to extend that there are 153 million orphans around the world. There's almost 500,000 kids in U.S. foster care today, and without the hope of a family, without the hope of a church that intervenes on their behalf, these are unreached people. The home is the best place to hear the gospel. The home is the place that we hear truth. The home is where we're raised to know and live in the fear and admonition of the Lord. And yet so many kids are missing that. And so as the Church of Jesus Christ, 3 simple things that you can do, and certainly the book and our website will unpack these even more. But just from 3 simple things. Number 1 is pray. You know, I think we need to give a piece of our prayer life to the fatherless. We need to give a piece of our prayer life to the vulnerable in the way that we pray to God our Father, asking him to open up our hearts, asking him to open up their hearts and put us in a place where we can be a difference maker. I think the second place that we can begin to integrate is our time. And it's a little bit more of a commitment, but we can be present in the lives of the vulnerable. Be present in the life of that woman in your neighborhood or in your family who's walking through an unplanned crisis pregnancy. Volunteer to be a respite family for a foster family, or maybe even if the Lord is calling you, agree to be a foster or adoptive parent. You don't have to do that. There's so many things you can do, but be willing to give just a piece of your time to care for the vulnerable. And then last, I say we've got to go. We've got to go, and we've got to be the hands and the feet around the world to the church to help other churches. As we go on mission, are we helping equip other churches to care for the orphan and vulnerable children in their neighborhoods? Are we helping to take what we're learning by caring for the vulnerable, and are we spreading that around the world to equip the global church to do the same? And so pray, we can give our time, and then we can certainly go on mission to make known the need of the vulnerable around the world.
Let's, if we can, talk about how, or again, you can take this book and you have whole sections on the marginalized, whether it's individuals caught in sexual trafficking or refugees or a variety of others. But I think the more significant connection point is the link that we have on our website, or you can go to lifelinechild.org. And first of all, there's a way in which you can engage your church. Now, we have, Herbie, some listeners that are pastors, Sunday school leaders, elders, deacons, whatever it might be, and they should click on that button there because there's a way in which they can learn a little bit more about how to get involved. And then there is a chapter on to be involved as well. There's a way that you can actually volunteer, attend an event, or there are ways that you can maybe get some access to a variety of the different resources that you have, which I might point people to as well, because you have the Defender podcast, you have various recommended resources, you have a resource library. There's just a lot of places where people can connect up with you. So take us through one more time what we can find when we land on your website.
Yes, for sure. So lifelinechild.org. And again, if you're a pastor, great resources for you to begin either slowly or wholesale, beginning to help your church see the call of the care of the vulnerable. And I think the biggest thing for the pastor today, when you see these resources, no, these are not social justice resources, but these are gospel-led resources. We believe as a ministry that the gospel is what leads us to care, but we care by making the gospel known. And so the gospel is influenced. The word of God is influenced in all of these things. We're not doing this for social justice. We're doing this for gospel proclamation. But then also, if you're interested in getting engaged, and it doesn't have to be to adopt or foster, but if you want to get engaged in the lives of the vulnerable in a meaningful, impactful, gospel-driven way, we have tons of resources and tons of ways for you to take the first step of involvement. And all it takes is the faithfulness to take the first step, and the Lord, with his grace and his goodness, will allow you to truly see life change for the sake of the gospel when we're faithful to his word and we're faithful to take the first step.
Well, Herbie, I want to say thank you, first of all, for the ministry that you've had all these years through Lifeline Children Services. And then thank you for not only taking the time to write this book, Image Bearers, Shifting from Pro-Birth to Pro-Life, but thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Oh, what a pleasure, Kerby. Anytime.
Again, this is really a good opportunity to once again set aside that myth that people that are pro-life only care about the baby inside the womb but don't care about anything else. I don't know how you could read through even just one of the chapters in the 12 chapters in this book and come to any other conclusion than Christians get involved in very tangible ways, and that the Bible encourages us to get involved in very significant ways. So 12 chapters, a number of discussion questions after each one. If you find yourself saying, this is maybe something we need to be talking about in our small group, in our life group, maybe in our Sunday school class, maybe in our church. This is a resource I think you're going to find very helpful as he takes us through so many of these different chapters, which gets us into everything from the difficulty of abortion to what it means to be truly pro-life, the problem of fatherlessness, the need for godly men, and also this issue, of course, of adoption and orphan care, and then whole chapters on everything from trafficking and elder care and refugees. It's really well done. The Image Bearers book, and I think you will find all the information you need at our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, Click on Viewpoints. You'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now. Be informed. Pointofview.net. Click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
My husband and I are your supporters. We just really appreciate the show and the people you bring on.
I just want to commend you guys on your program. I love listening to you.
It's a blessing. Been listening to you for several years. Your program has helped my family see current events and elections and politics through the eyes and the principles of Scripture. And that's been enlightening, and we're trying to pass that on to others.
I want to say, first of all, that I really enjoyed the Millennial Roundtable, and I love the program altogether. I think Kerby is great, and I really appreciate all of y'all, all that y'all do, and the truth that y'all put out.
Hey, great show. Love all your comments and what you're talking about.
Thanks again for what you do.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, second hour, and let me just again reiterate what I said the first hour, but I know people tune in and tune out, so you may not have heard, and you will receive an email from me. I'm looking at it right now, in which we point out that we did have a fundraising goal and were able to exceed it. So again, this victory, as I point out, is because of the generous supporters like you who gave to Point of View during our Truth Team Week, and the donations that flooded in last week, including many monthly giving commitments, will help us keep truth on the air for generations to come. So I thought I would mention that again. As I mentioned last hour, we actually still have some match left over. So if you were saying, well, I didn't give last week, or I meant to, and I was out of town, or didn't hear the program, we still have the banner up that says Anchored to Truth, and our goal, which we now have reached, but we still have match money on the table, and I'd kind of like to see if we could finish that off. So if there are a few of you that are saying, well, I meant to give, but I didn't get around to it, well, we've given you that opportunity to do so. And when we talk about truth, you're going to start seeing some things over the next couple of weeks, so I thought I'd give it to you right now. Our first article is entitled, Who's Really Twisting the COVID Record? Now, what's that all about? You might remember 5 years ago, you probably weren't in church on Easter, were you? No. And as a matter of fact, if I told you 6 years ago on this program that this coming Easter, not only will you not be in church on Easter, no one else will be in church on Easter. I saw one post today where they're talking about 5 years ago where the Pope was speaking to an empty group because, of course, everybody's fearful of COVID. And we've all been through that, and that's in the rearview mirror. But now comes what I think is one of the most difficult set of circumstances that any country faces, and that is who's going to write the history. And, of course, the old line, especially from progressives, is, well, history is written by the victors. Well, there is some truth to that, but the reality is now just the opposite. History is written by the progressive liberal professors. The history professors, the people that write books. And more importantly, you're starting to have some people that are making some pretty outrageous statements. So this first article is by Jack Butler. I've never really interviewed him. I think I need to, because he really is on top of some issues. But he actually quotes from an article that was in The Atlantic by Jonathan Chatt, who forgives, as he says, the ideological compatriots their COVID-era sins. Okay, it's a long way to simply say this, that some of the things that the Biden administration got wrong, some of the things that Anthony Fauci got wrong, some of the claims that were made that were not accurate, many of the various ways in which social media actually removed individuals, deplatformed individuals, demonetized individuals. Well, you know, that's just, because we got some of it wrong because we didn't know more. And to be honest, a couple of weeks ago, that might have been a good argument. Because if you remember, oftentimes around this table, Kelly Shackelford would say, look, I'm not so upset about somebody getting it wrong, but I was more upset about people being so dogmatic when they didn't know. And so the reality sometimes was, because the American people are pretty forgiving, well, we didn't really know how bad the virus was. We didn't know how it was formed, or we wasn't sure how it was transmitted. We didn't necessarily know where it was coming from, on and on and on. And so the only thing we could really be upset with is the fact they were so dogmatic about that. Well, now you can sit down, and I would encourage you to do so, and read the so-called Twitter files and recognize that we have emails showing that everybody pretty much knew that the virus came from a lab leak from the Wuhan Institute for Virology. Didn't come from some kind of wet market, that there were very strong reservations about how effective masks were in the first place. There were people early on even expressing their concerns about whether or not we should have a complete lockdown. So this article, I think, is an attempt to say, look, the article in Atlantic really overstates the case for the idea of some kind of leftist introspection, and instead it gives them just a tremendous amount of grace. And then for our listeners in Georgia, he recalls that the Atlantic, the one that is the article that we're quoting from here, is one that declared that the Georgia Governor Brian Kemp's loosening of the COVID restrictions was an experiment in human sacrifice. So before some people forget about how dogmatic, even mean-spirited some of this was, it might be really important. And then he points out that the person that's kind of leading the charge is a man by the name of Dr. Anthony Fauci, in which, first of all, he plays, as he said, word games between the terms shut down and lockdown, saying, well, we did shut down some of this, but we didn't lock them down. We didn't do what other countries did, where you couldn't even leave your house, you couldn't go to work. Oh, I remember some places where you couldn't do that. And so, again, trying to talk about such fine distinctions really ignore the fact that we did keep people out of school. We did keep people out of work. We kept people out of parks. We arrested people sometimes if they were walking by themselves on a beach. So let's not forget all of that. And then points out, Anthony Fauci at one point saying, look, in the fall of 2020, I was saying, open the schools as quickly and as safely as possible. Open the schools, close the bars. Well, again, this article goes on to point out, actually, that was until almost early December. So maybe that's fall, but not really. And again, he was saying things like it's much better to close the bars and keep the schools open, to keep the bars open and keep. But again, it was still then pretty soon saying, no, we need some more resources. And then, of course, the Biden administration, influenced in large part by the teacher unions, actually said, no, it's not good to open the schools. And so then you had Anthony Fauci even back off from that as well. So one of the things I thought was interesting, you can read this article, but you'll also notice something else. Near the end, there are all these quotes and comments, and one of the comments was simply, well, it's hard to find middle ground. Well, again, we tried to provide that. You can remember that when this virus began to unfold, we brought an individual in here to counter some of the myths going around about the virus, although unfortunately he died later of COVID. But you can remember when we brought in Curtis Chang. Matter of fact, we quoted from him last week, and other individuals on one side. But we also brought in Jay Richards and those individuals that wrote the book, The Price of Panic. And that was even before Anthony Fauci said some of this, in which they'd run the numbers and saying, look, these lockdowns are not doing any better than having an open society. So we were giving various kinds of views. Sometimes we even talked about some of the concerns with the vaccine. But of course, you know what happened. As long as you towed the line with the Biden administration, no problem. The moment you disagreed, then we got deplatformed and actually censored in all sorts of ways. So it was really hard, even though we tried to provide some middle ground and to give both sides. That wasn't allowed in that debate. That's why I think this first article is one you might want to read. We're going to take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
If you want to understand the collapse of the Judeo-Christian consensus in this country, you need to look beyond individual programs and policies and take a more expansive view. In a speech for Hillsdale last year, Christopher Rufo of the Manhattan Institute provided a multi-decade description. The original leftist dream expected a rebellion from the working class in America. That never took place by the end of the 1960s. Leftists therefore abandoned their original plan of waging a revolution with the proletariat and instead focused on the elites. The idea can easily be traced to an Italian communist by the name of Antonio Gramsci, who I sometimes mention on my radio program. He proposed capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society. This long march through American institutions began a half-century ago, and if you look around today, you can see that it has been most successful. Christopher Rufo says that he has looked at the federal bureaucracy, the universities, K-12 schools, and big corporations. What he found is the revolutionary ideas of the 1960s have been repackaged, repurposed, and injected into American life at the institutional level. He adds that most Americans were shocked to discover this. They were outraged that children were being taught gender theory and critical race theory, that the educational elite saw no problem with teaching about race, sex, and gender at very young ages. Those revelations and the inevitable backlash had an impact on various state and local elections and will continue to be issues parents will need to address in the future. The lesson here is that all of this didn't happen by chance, but was planned decades ago. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Inflation, go to viewpoints.info/inflation. That's viewpoints.info/inflation. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I want to talk about an election tomorrow in Wisconsin. Again, this is a national program, but in some respects, people think that from time to time, some of these special elections or even mid-term elections are significant. And the reason for that is this. Voters in Wisconsin will go to the polls tomorrow to elect a state Supreme Court justice. That wouldn't necessarily have national significance, but this one does, because whoever is elected will determine whether or not the court will maintain its current 4-3 ideological balance. And so in some respects, it's begun to be significant in terms of what might happen in the future in the state of Wisconsin, in terms of everything from how these gerrymandered districts are actually put together might make a difference into whether or not Wisconsin is something that Democrats have a better chance of winning than Republicans, how it might affect the presidential election and the rest. But because of its national influence and certainly its significance, now we also know, this is the other part of this story, that nearly 5,000 potentially illegal voter registrations have been recovered just in the city of Milwaukee. Are you with me? On close elections, 5,000 can make a big difference. And this came from a challenge backed by the federal Help America Vote Act and a long list of statutes, including the Milwaukee Election Commission. And so let's, if I can, very quickly, I don't want to overdo this, break down these 5,000 questionable voter registrations. 2,926 registrations listed incorrectly or missing apartment numbers. 540 voters were flagged as N or blank, indicating they don't even exist in that address any longer. 501 voters listed P.O. boxes as physical addresses. That's actually a violation. 377 had filed permanent change of address requests out of state, yet still they're managed to vote in Wisconsin. 281 moved to a different county. 217 left no forwarding address. All the way down, you can get the idea. And so once again, it shows the problem with the voter rolls. So if you're a conservative, you've got to say, hey, this thing going on in Wisconsin, this concerns me because we have what seem to be a lot of illegal voter registrations. However, if you're a liberal, you're going to point out something else, and that is Elon Musk. Many people think that this election tomorrow will be a referendum on Elon Musk. Because, first of all, if you're not familiar, Elon Musk is really involved in some of these elections. He had a Sunday night town hall, and before the town hall, he had actually, many weeks ago, offered, and this is what one individual called a cheeky offer, to give two $1 million checks in a sweepstakes to people in Wisconsin who signed a petition against activist judges. The petition says judges should interpret laws as written, not rewrite them to fit their personal or political agendas. Not that controversial. Anyway, of the individuals that signed it, they, I guess, had a lottery, and he last night gave two $1 million checks to those people in Wisconsin, which, of course, has led to all sorts of signs. If you have not seen them, Wisconsin Supreme Court is not for sale. Wisconsin is not for sale. The picture of Elon Musk and the rest, because two people were actually enticed to actually sign the petition. Now, the argument is that he's actually buying votes. Okay, he's not really doing that. But if you want to talk about buying votes, you can go all the way back to George Washington. If you don't know the story, George Washington, the first time he ran for the House of Burgesses, his opponent actually gave people, I think it was beer, whiskey, rum, maybe even wine, if they voted for him. And George Washington lost to the House of Burgesses. So next time he learned his lesson, and so he was giving out whiskey as well and a variety of other forms of alcohol. So we don't allow that to happen any longer. But you can see that all of a sudden Wisconsin has been sort of ground zero, as if the various places where Tesla cars are being distributed and sold isn't also a ground zero. It is quite possible with even the latest action by Elon Musk that he may become the most hated man in America. But it illustrates again that what is going on in Wisconsin is very significant. And so some of the progressives have argued, and it's probably true, that this petition, signing this petition, might have motivated some of these low propensity voters who might have stayed home to actually go out and vote. And of course, on the other hand, we can point out that we have at least 5,000 voter registrations just in the city of Milwaukee that are somewhat suspect. So welcome to the problem of elections in America. And again, I thought I would mention that since you may be hearing some stories about this particular race for the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Maybe now you know a little bit more about what's kind of going on behind the scenes. But just before we take a break, let me just mention that over the last couple of weeks, I've been doing articles about the fact that if indeed Donald Trump is bringing jobs back to America, and it does seem that some of these tariffs are working. I'm going to have more to say about tariffs tomorrow, but today, let's just say that obviously we're going to create more jobs in America The problem is we have a lot of people that aren't willing to work in those jobs. Which brings me to this article from Fortune magazine, in which they have pointed out a very disturbing trend. And the trend is this: over 4 million Gen Zers are jobless, and experts blame colleges for their worthless degrees. What they're really talking about is a new acronym I think I would teach you about today. It's called NEET, N-E-E-T. The N stands for not, E stands for education, E stands for employment, and T stands for training. What they're talking about is there are 4 million individuals who are in the Gen Z. Remember, the other articles I've talked about are those who would be in the millennial generation or older. But now we're talking about the younger generation, Generation Z. And the article says that now some Gen Zers may fall into this category because they're taking care of a family member, but most of them are not. They're not in education and not getting a degree. They're not employed, and they're not even getting training. They're not learning how to program computers. They're not learning as an apprentice how to be a plumber, a carpenter, or electrician, whatever it might be. And again, one of the political commentators in this article blames society's values because they say we've sent these kids off to college for worthless degrees, which he says have produced nothing for them at all, and then concludes they would be better off if they apprenticed to plumbers or electricians. They'd be able to look forward to a much more abundant and satisfying life. But, of course, part of that problem is we've made it sound like the only path to financial success is a college degree, and yet many of those that graduate lack the skills necessary for the 21st century, because I will argue that just as robotics have changed the nature of employment in factories, artificial intelligence now may really be changing the white-collar job market. But as we've talked about so often before, there isn't just a skills gap, there is a will gap. What about these individuals that are not in school, not in education, they're not employed, and they're not getting training, and they seem to be a little less work motivated than previous generations. And the article then laments that Gen Z finds doom scrolling at home more enjoyable than navigating an economy completely different than what their teachers promised them. Doom scrolling is where you just scroll through your phone. You know what I'm talking about, so I won't go any further. So again, there's an obvious argument to be made for the fact that maybe pastors from the pulpit, certainly parents, certainly other leaders in the business world need to really encourage this generation to deal with the two issues, the skills gap, but most importantly, the will gap, and maybe develop, once again, a Christian view of the work ethic. And so it's just another one of those articles. This one appeared in Fortune magazine. So again, when we come back, we're going to talk about two articles, one that appeared in the New York Times and another that appeared in the Los Angeles Times. And so, again, we can see that a lot of people are talking about some of the same issues we address here on Point of View. Maybe a little too late, but we'll take them whenever we can get them. Let's take a break. We'll come back and talk about those right after this.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult. And that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we've got quite a bit of time left that we can still cover some issues. It will be a little busier tomorrow because we have Coach Joe Kennedy with us for the entire hour, and then we have Gary Chapman for about a half an hour. So many of these things that I'm talking about, I'm trying to slip in today because there won't be a whole lot of time tomorrow, but we can always cover it later in the week if we might actually avoid too many problems by posting some of this late. But I am going to, in just a minute, quote from the New York Times, but there was an op-ed in the New York Times, which I've just got to begin to mention briefly, if for no other reason than this gets down to shamelessness, chutzpah. There's another word or two you can think of, and that is the op-ed that appeared in the New York Times. Now, the New York Times obviously wants to comment on the scandal that developed last week when you had various leaders, and it's Pete Hegseth and Mike Waltz and a number of others that were communicating on Signal, and as a result also had the editor of The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, part of that. I do believe that there's a possibility that was done intentionally by one of the lower staffers, but we'll leave that for another day. But when it came time for them to post an op-ed, an opinion piece in the New York Times, you might say, well, who would they possibly get? And Jim Garrity says, well, you can probably guess who they got. Hillary Clinton. Now, just think about this for a minute, because she's actually writing about the fact it's not the hypocrisy that bothers me, it's the stupidity. We're all shocked. And then you're saying, wait a minute, now is this not the woman, is not the leader, isn't this not the Secretary of State and then presidential candidate Hillary Clinton, who had plenty of classified information in just her emails, who actually then admitted she wasn't thinking about whether her emails were sufficiently secure when she worked as Secretary of State. And then at least 8 times we can document she lied about what was in those emails. And then, of course, you even have the former FBI director at the time, James Comey, who said that he would not prosecute her, but certainly admitted that she was extremely careless in handling very sensitive, highly classified information. And you have to wonder who's running the editorial desk of the New York Times. Of all the people you could pick, Hillary Clinton is the one that actually had the op-ed there. And Jim Garrity, tongue-in-cheek, says, well, my goodness, almost literally anyone else on earth is on more solid ground when it comes to criticizing the Trump team for being reckless and sloppy about protecting America's secrets. What, was Julian Assange not available? No, Edward Snowden not available? I guess the only reason the Times didn't run an op-ed by Sandy Berger is because he died in 2015. And if you remember Sandy Berger, he actually went into a secure site of archives and was stuffing down his pants. I'm not making this up. Some of these classified documents. And again, you have to wonder who is running the editorial desk of the New York Times. But with that as a little bit of an embarrassment to the New York Times, let me now try to deal with the fact that the New York Times has finally recognized that it's time for them to say to the leaders in the Democratic Party, you have a problem. The title of this came out March 29th. It was our second article here. The Democrats are in denial about 2024. And the bottom line is, this comes from the editorial board of the New York Times. I'm quoting now from the editors. Last year's election was close despite President Trump's hyperbolic claims about his margin of victory. Still, the Democratic Party clearly lost, and not only the presidential race, it also lost control of the Senate, failed to recapture the House of Representatives. Of the 11 governors' races held last year, Democrats won 3. In state legislative races, they won fewer than 45% of the seats. You got to love the New York Times by at least putting the facts out on the table, which seem to have eluded a few individuals. I'll skip a couple of paragraphs and say, look, the key argument being used right now by some of the Democratic leaders was voter turnout. Party leaders claim that most Americans still prefer Democrats, but that voter apathy allowed Donald Trump to win. Now, they said, according to this logic, Democrats do not need to worry about winning back Trump voters, but instead should just try to animate the country's natural liberal majority. which, of course, is fallacious. But then they even post a quote from the governor of Minnesota. You might remember him. Tim Walz ran as vice president, in which Tim Walz said, I don't think we're going to win over those 77 million that voted for Donald Trump. So instead, he says, we'll just try to find the ones that didn't vote, which is interesting. And what the editors of the New York Times said, let's give them credit, an unfortunate echo of Hillary Clinton saying that millions of Trump voters were deplorables and irredeemable. So again, you wouldn't have expected the New York Times to say that. They said part of the story, of course, is inflation. Prices surged during COVID supply chain disruptions, and so that might have hurt some incumbent parties. But then they point out that, yes, some of the parties did lose power in the United States, Brazil, Britain, places like that, but other incumbent parties managed to win re-election. They go through this long list: Denmark, France, India, Japan, Mexico, and all the rest, Spain. So that's not the case. And so they say, look, we recognize the Democratic Party is in a difficult position. It must compete with a Republican Party, now they've got to get their shots in, that shows an alarming hostility to American democracy. And we urge Democrats to speak out against Mr. Trump's authoritarian behavior. But even after they've kind of taken their shot at Donald Trump and the Republicans and all that kind of stuff, they then have 3 steps. So here's the 3-step solution to the Democratic Party from the New York Times editorial board. Number 1, first they should admit that the party mishandled Mr. Biden's age. You think? That alone probably lost so much credibility when people with their own eyes could see that Joe Biden was not the same Joe Biden of decades before. But nevertheless, they need to admit that they mishandled it. Maybe even apologize for that. Haven't seen that yet. Second, Democrats should recognize the party moved, and again, this comes from the editorial board of the New York Times. The Democratic Party moved too far left on social issues after Barack Obama left office in 2017. The old video clips of Kamala Harris that the Trump campaign gleefully replayed last year on decriminalizing the border and government-funded gender transition surgery for prisoners highlighted the problem. She goes on, the editors go on to say, even today, the party remains too focused on personal identity and on Americans' differences by race, gender, sexuality, and religion, rather than our shared values. On these issues, progressives sometimes adopt a scolding, censorious posture. And so, again, he said, the editors mentioned that it's alienated growing numbers of Asian voters, black voters, and Latino voters. So far, so good. I'm sure some of us would have probably said the same things, but this came from the editorial board of the New York Times. So first, admit mishandling Joe Biden's age. Number 2, move too far left. Number 3, and this is important too, the party has to offer new ideas. When Democrats emerged from the wilderness in the past, they often did so with fresh ideas. They updated the proud Democratic tradition of improving life on all Americans. They talk about Bill Clinton. They talk about Barack Obama, talk about a number of examples of that having taken place in the future. And so, again, they point out how Kamala Harris failed to be able to do some of those things in the campaign. And if nothing else, ends with this very important statement. Defeat has a long history of inspiring honest reflection in politics. In this time of frustration and anxiety for Democrats, they should give it a try. You gotta love the editorial board of the New York Times, and if you'd like to read it all the way through, again, it's 5 pages of point after point, some of which we've shared around the table. And as I've said before, it is sometimes surprising that eventually common sense breaks out, and they are really trying to say to the Democratic leadership, you need to rethink some very important issues. And most importantly, if you're going to continue to camp out on these really far left, progressive leftist ideas, and offer no significant solutions, you're going to lose more elections in the future. 3 cheers for the New York Times editorial board. We've got more to cover right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that I've heard from a number of individuals that we still have some of that match money available, because some of you might have said, okay, I heard at the very beginning of the program that you met your goal, and we're grateful for that, and we're actually going to use some of that for equipment that desperately needs to be replaced. But some of you might say, well, if you met your goal, fine. But the bottom line is as I mentioned, as we were coming to the end of Friday, we had an individual put a $10,000 match on the table. So it turns out that over the weekend, we were able to get some of that taken care of, but we still have some on the table. And I remember years ago, Brad Fisk used to say, you know, if you put $10,000 on the table and then you took away, say, $8,000, there's still $2,000 left. I don't know what the numbers are right now, or something like that. You still wouldn't leave $2,000 on the table. And so I just thought I'd mention for some of you that are wondering, if I give right now, if I go to the website pointofview.net, click on the button that says join now on Anchored to Truth, will that be matched? And as far as I've heard just a few minutes ago, it will be. Or, of course, you want to call that number again. It's 800-347-5151, 1-800-347-5151. Apparently, we still have a match on the table. I'd love to get that taken care of, just for no other reason. It's just a unique situation we never had before. Usually we meet the match usually before the end of Friday, and we did not, because it came in so late. So if you've been waiting, maybe you didn't have a chance to give last week, you meant to, or maybe you didn't hear the program, and you're just maybe even right now just tuning in, hearing me talk about just a few minutes ago an article from the New York Times. Now I'm going to talk about an article from the Los Angeles Times while I'm talking, or even as we go off the air, you could still make that phone call or go to the website. But I did want to get to this one because it's another good example of something we've been talking about for some time here on Point of View, and that is the issue of civility and rudeness. Matter of fact, we have a booklet where a good section of that deals with civility. I might even make it a whole booklet in the future. But Mark Barabak, I don't know much about him, although he's pretty obviously an anti-Trump individual, which is almost irrelevant other than the fact that he blames Donald Trump for the lack of civility and rudeness. But he certainly acknowledges that a lot of this has been going on for some time. But he says, if you've driven on the freeway in recent years, been to a grocery store, attended a movie or a live performance, heck, if you've even been sentient, the findings of a new poll will startle you about as much as the sun rising at dawn and setting at dusk. The poll illustrates that people have gotten ruder. Wasn't even sure the word ruder is a word, but he uses it, so it must be. People are very rude, probably a better way to say it. And then goes and gives you a poll that came from the Pew Research Center. By the way, we've done some polls over the years. I've checked into it. I think I would always go to the Matt on the Pew surveys. They do a very good job. They're very professional. And they found that just under half of U.S. adults polled, 47%, said the way people behave in public these days is ruder than before the pandemic. And 2 in 10 say today's behavior is a lot ruder. Then they point out there's a few people that actually thought people had become more polite, and they wondered if these people have been under anesthetic. Okay, but here we are. So they take into account a couple of things. First of all, politics and polarization. Everything's a war, Don Sipple says, who's a veteran communication strategist. Everything's a battle. There's no collaboration. There's no coordination, no civic pride. And so that is the case. But then you have to maybe say, okay, where do people see the greatest amount of rudeness? This was interesting in the Pew poll because, for example, 3/4, 77% said it's rarely or never acceptable to smoke around others. I didn't think that'd be top of the list, but okay. I would agree, but it surprised me that one's up there. 74% say the same about taking a photo or video of somebody without their permission, which is interesting. And then about 2/3 said it was rarely or never acceptable to bring a child to an adult venue, like a bar, upscale restaurant, something like that, or to visibly display swear words on a T-shirt or things, or curse loud in public. And that gets back to this whole idea of civility. When we have started doing programs, as a matter of fact, I think I started doing a program, Marlon asked me to do one, I think it was in August of 1986. And shortly thereafter, I had a chance to interview an individual that had written a very good book, a professor at Yale, on civility. And really, since the 1990s all the way now into the 2020s, I've talked about this issue of civility. And the original book actually got into a little bit of it from a biblical point of view. He's an African-American professor and came from a church background, but it really wasn't kind of a deep dive into what does the Bible say about civility. And so I began to develop talks. I, of course, have some of that in one of our booklets and all of the rest. And one of the things I began to conclude is as this culture moves away from a Judeo-Christian foundation, rudeness is almost a natural byproduct. After you move from a time in which we would think that you would want to treat another individual as you would like to be treated, that's called the golden rule, you can see why people have become more rude. And as a result, I've argued that just because we are recognizing a lack of civility doesn't mean that we need to give everybody maybe some training in mismanners, because the problem isn't whether or not you have a curse word on your T-shirt, whether or not you chew somebody out, whether you cut somebody off on traffic. It has to do with the fact that there's kind of a deeper issue there as well. And so, again, in this article, so interesting, Mark Barabak reminds us, of course, again, here's where he shows his bias, of Republican presidents who actually had to apologize for something they said. I'll just read one. Back in 1992, when President George Herbert Walker Bush referred to his Democratic rivals, at that time it'd be Bill Clinton and Al Gore, as two bozos, he later apologized for that and had to. But it's interesting that then he gives another example or two, but they're all Republicans. And I was thinking, has he not just read the New York Times we just read a minute ago, which reminded us of Hillary Clinton referring to anybody that supported Donald Trump as deplorables and irredeemables? Was he completely unaware that Barack Obama was caught on mic as referring to people in the Midwest and even in some of the Rust Belt states as people who are bitter and cling to their guns or religion? So again, he wants to lay a lot of the blame on the rudeness on the President of the United States, who does have a mouth, not denying that at all. But I think some of this happened long before people ever thought that Donald Trump would run for the presidency, and it's an ongoing cultural issue. But let's at least give him credit. He recognizes that rudeness is a problem, and again, this is a place where maybe we as Christians can model better behavior in a culture and maybe begin to turn a culture around. We saw that happening during Victorian England. I think it can happen again. So if nothing else, last two articles, one from the New York Times, one from the Los Angeles Times, I thought you'd find them interesting indeed. Don't forget, tomorrow, we're going to spend some time talking with Coach Kennedy and a couple of other individuals. But one last time as we go off the air, if you'd like to join with us in our Truth Team or give even a one-time gift, again, the banner Anchored to Truth is on the website, pointofview.net, and the line that you can call 1-800-347-5151. Still have a match on the table, a dollar-for-dollar match, if you'd like to take advantage of that. Megan, thank you for your help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.